Some secrets are written in silence, and no one expects them to scream. On a Tuesday night in October, a 17-year-old girl named Maya collapsed in the middle of her biology class, her body hitting the floor like a question no one knew how to answer. When she woke up in Springfield General Hospital, her eyes were open but her voice was gone, swallowed by something the doctors couldn't see on their scans or explain with their charts. They transferred her to the West Wing, a part of the hospital most visitors never saw, a corridor where the lights hummed too loud and the air tasted like old paint and forgotten things. Room 312 became her cage, and for 3 days, Maya said nothing, her silence so thick it made the nurses uncomfortable, made them check on her less, made them glad when their shifts ended and someone else had to sit with that quiet. But every night, when the hallway emptied and the only sound was the wheeze of the ventilation system, Maya would drag herself to the window, her fingertip meeting the cold glass that fogged with her breath, and she would write. At first, it was just shapes, patterns that made no sense to the cleaning staff who wiped them away each morning without thinking twice. But on the fourth night, a nurse named Carol, a woman who'd worked the overnight shift for 12 years and had seen enough to know when something wasn't right, stopped in the doorway of room 312 and watched. Maya's hand moved slowly across the glass, deliberate, trembling, and when she stepped back, Carol's heart dropped into her stomach because the words weren't random. They weren't the ramblings of a sick girl. They were clear and cold and impossible to ignore. They heard us in the dark, the window said, and beneath it a number. Room 318. Carol felt her throat tighten because room 318 was just down the hall, occupied by an elderly man named Mr. Pemberton who'd been there for weeks, a stroke patient who couldn't move much, couldn't speak, couldn't fight back. And suddenly Carol's mind raced through every time she'd seen Dr. Brennan enter that room alone, every time she'd heard a strange thud or a muffled cry that she'd convinced herself was nothing. The next night, Carol came back, her hands shaking as she stood outside room 312, waiting, and Maya wrote again, this time faster, more desperate, the fog on the glass barely keeping up with her finger. Room 305. They take things. They take everything. Carol knew room 305, a young woman in her 20s who'd come in after a car accident, who had been doing well until suddenly she wasn't, until her belongings started disappearing, until she stopped making eye contact with anyone. Until she requested discharge and left in the middle of the night against medical advice, and no one asked why. Carol felt sick, the kind of sick that starts in your gut and crawls up into your chest, making it hard to breathe because she was starting to see the pattern, starting to understand that the silence in the West Wing wasn't just about sick people resting, it was enforced, cultivated, protected by people who wore white coats and smiled at families during visiting hours. On the sixth night, Maya's message was different, urgent, terrifying. Tonight. Room 310. Stop them. Room 310 was 2 doors down, and Carol knew who was in there, a 14-year-old boy named Danny, who'd been admitted after a suicide attempt, a kid who barely spoke, who flinched when anyone touched him, who had that same haunted look Maya had, that same swallowed scream. Carol didn't think. She just moved, her feet carrying her down the hallway, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might give her away, and when she reached room 310, she heard voices inside, low and harsh, and one of them belonged to Dr. Brennan. She pressed herself against the wall, her hand on her phone, recording, because she knew no one would believe her otherwise, not without proof, not when the man on the other side of that door was respected, trusted, untouchable. You tell anyone and it gets worse. Dr. Brennan's voice came through the crack in the door, calm and clinical, like he was discussing medication dosages, not threatening a child. You understand me, Danny? Worse. Carol's fingers trembled as she hit record, as she captured every word, every threat, every second of evidence that would later unravel everything Springfield General thought it knew about itself. When Dr. Brennan finally left the room, Carol slipped inside, found Danny curled on his side, tears streaming down his face, and she whispered the only thing she could think to say. "You're safe now. I promise." But the truth was bigger than one doctor, bigger than one night, because when Carol went to Maya's room to thank her, to tell her she'd done the right thing, Maya wrote one more message on the glass, and this one shattered everything. Nurse Patterson, Orderly James, Dr. Keller, all of them. The names kept coming, 5, 6, 7 people, a network that had operated in plain sight, hiding behind credentials and scrubs and the assumption that no one would believe the patients, especially the ones who couldn't speak, who couldn't fight, who had nowhere else to go. Carol stood there, staring at the window, feeling the weight of every ignored complaint, every dismissed concern, every time she told herself she was imagining things, and she understood then that Maya hadn't lost her voice from illness. She'd lost it from terror, from knowing that speaking up meant becoming a target, that silence was the only shield she had left. The investigation that followed was brutal and necessary. Police filling the West Wing, reporters crowding the parking lot, families demanding answers, and one by one, the truth came out in depositions and testimony, in medical records that had been altered, in staff members who finally broke their silence because they couldn't carry the guilt anymore. Dr. Brennan was arrested, along with 4 others, their faces on every news channel, their crimes laid bare for a city that couldn't believe this had happened in their hospital, in their community, under their noses. Maya never spoke during the trial, but she didn't need to, because her messages had said everything, had broken open a darkness that had thrived on the assumption that vulnerable people don't have voices worth hearing. When it was finally over, when the last defendant was sentenced and the hospital began the long process of rebuilding trust, Carol went back to room 312, even though it was empty now, even though Maya had been discharged weeks ago. Sent home to a family that held her tighter and believed her in ways they hadn't before. Carol stood at the window, looking out at the parking lot below, and she thought about all the messages she'd almost ignored, all the signs she'd almost dismissed, all the voices she'd almost failed to hear, and she realized that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't the people who do terrible things. It's the people who see terrible things and convince themselves it's not their problem, not their responsibility, not their place to speak up. Maya had lost her voice, but she found a way to scream anyway, and sometimes that's what courage looks like, not loud and obvious, but quiet and persistent, writing truth on foggy glass in the middle of the night when no one thinks anyone is watching. And maybe that's the thing none of us want to admit, that the difference between a victim and a survivor, between a tragedy and a rescue, is often just one person who decides to pay attention, who decides that silence is not acceptance, who decides that the whisper matters just as much as the shout. Carol never saw Maya again, but she heard she went back to school, that she joined the debate team, that her voice came back slowly but fully, and every time Carol walked past room 312, she remembered that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to be quiet, even when the world has given you every reason to disappear.